Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait a couple minutes before we get started as people log on. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining. I see people are gradually coming on in, and I think we're going to get started now. My name is Aisha Mera, and I'm the Director of Major Giving and Corporate Partnerships here at the Legal Aid Society. I'm very pleased to be here today and with all of you for a very important topic. Before we get started, we're going to talk through some housekeeping. First, the event will be recorded. The chat is disabled and the Q&A function is enabled. So you'll be able to ask your questions throughout, and we'll get to them after the panel discussion, which will be 20 to 30 minutes long. And without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator to you today, Corey Stoughton. She spearheads our efforts of the Legal Aid Society's Criminal Defense Practice Special Litigation Unit, which addresses systemic legal issues affecting the legal rights of Legal Aid's public defense clients. Over the last year, Corey and her team have led the efforts to release hundreds of medically vulnerable people following the uncontrolled outbreak of COVID-19 on Rikers Island. Prior to Legal Aid, Corey is well known for her tenure at the New York Civil Liberties Union, where she worked for over a decade on a broad range of constitutional and human rights issues. Corey has also worked at Liberty, the UK's leading domestic human rights organization, where she challenged the UK's domestic surveillance regime, indefinite immigration detention, and the criminalization of homelessness. She's also served as a senior counsel to Vanita Gupta when she led the Civil Rights Division in the US Department of Justice under President Obama. She's also an adjunct clinical professor of law at New York University School of Law. And I'm very pleased, without any further ado, to welcome Corey, who will say a bit more about her unit and introduce all of our wonderful panelists today.
Thanks so much, Aisha, and welcome everybody to the virtual roundtable discussion about marijuana legalization. As you'll see today, Legal Aid's law reform units have been really intimately involved with the effort to legalize marijuana in the state of New York. We come at issues like this from a three-pronged strategy of doing impact litigation, developing innovative policy initiatives, and also doing coalition building and public education around these issues. And as you'll hear the story of marijuana legalization and where we're taking it next, you'll see all those different kind of tools come into play here. In that work, we leverage Legal Aid's unique role as the only citywide and the city's largest and oldest public defender and provider of direct legal services in all 5 boroughs of New York. And we work to center the experiences of our clients in all of the work that we do to fight back on kind of those systemic barriers to justice that we see in things like New York's formerly excessively punitive marijuana laws. So without further delay, I really want to introduce you to the most interesting people in this discussion, which are our staff panelists to discuss this issue. And I want to give you a brief background on each of them so you know who they are and their connection to this issue, and then we'll get into the discussion. So if you guys, panelists, if you want to join me here on the call, I'll introduce each of you. We're joined here by Oredeko. Anne is the supervising attorney of the Racial Justice Unit, and through her connections with organizations and activists across the city, Anne facilitates Know Your Rights workshops, provides legal observing and legal advice to activists and organizers across the city. In the summer of 2020, she created the Black Legal Observer Collective with other Black attorneys to provide direct support to Black activists during the uprisings of 2020. And in her role at Legal Aid, she was one of the representatives of Legal Aid on the Start Smart Coalition, which was the coalition that led to the implementation of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. Anthony Posada is the supervising attorney of the Community Justice Unit at Legal Aid, where he coordinates our efforts to encourage positive interactions between local community members and our city's justice system. Our CJU, our Community Justice Unit, was founded to provide direct and essential legal services to members of New York City's Cure Violence program, which is a violence interruption program. And as it's Gun Violence Awareness Month, I think it's a particularly important time to draw attention to the critical importance of that work as a non-law enforcement-led solution to gun crime and to violence in the city. And Anthony's really an essential part of that program. As part of that, he helps oversee our team that supports those Cure Violence partners in doing their violence interruption work, and also coordinates Know Your Rights events and community events on a variety of issues that Legal Aid works with our community partners. And then we have Emma Goodman, who's a staff attorney in our Case Closed project. The Case Closed project is a project to help people seal criminal records that are eligible for sealing under New York's current statutory regime for expunging criminal records, expunging and sealing criminal records. Emma was also a member with a representative of Legal Aid on the Start Smart Coalition, and is also currently a member of the steering committee of the Clean Slate New York Coalition, which is a coalition working to bring automatic expungement of criminal records to all New Yorkers. And she has been responsible in her work for expunging more than 500,000 convictions for loitering and marijuana offenses statewide. So really an incredible accomplishment. So that's our panel. With that, I want to just frame up the issue and then kick it to our panelists to tell you, to share their expertise and experience with you. This month we marked the 50th anniversary of America's war on drugs. And we all know, I think everyone has been educated about the devastating toll that war has taken on America, with millions of lives destroyed due to the enforcement of punitive drug laws. And, there are many laws and policies that led to drug-related over-policing and incarceration. These are a few examples kind of relative to New York. We went through some reforms of things like the most punitive Rockefeller drug law reforms in, earlier in New York's history. But we know that even after that, the communities, especially in New York City, the communities we work with were directly impacted by the disproportionate and excessively punitive enforcement of those drug laws. So we want to talk a bit about the landmark victory that we had this year to get at that problem, which was the passage of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, the MRTA, which was a critical piece of legislation that is increasingly being seen across the country as the definitive model for how to decriminalize and legalize marijuana. So to get this discussion started, I really want to kick it first to the panel. And I want to start with Anne. If you could tell us a bit, from the perspective of Legal Aid and our clients, why was the legalization of marijuana so important? We made this, one of our top priorities for the last several years. And you can provide, our audience like a sense of kind of what was it that made this such an essential piece of legislation to focus on?
Yeah, thank you, Corey. And thank you for having us, and thank you for joining us in this important conversation. And so coming into the reason why marijuana legalization was such a crucial fact for Legal Aid and such a crucial issue for us is, I know for me, coming into my role as the supervising attorney of the Racial Justice Unit, one of the things that I saw as such a historic racial injustice has been the way marijuana criminalization has shaped and has formed many of the ways that oppression and essentially racial inequalities have happened within our country. And so even thinking about the history of marijuana criminalization and looking at, like in the 1930s, how the discourse started to shift around marijuana and how it's specifically targeting Mexican Americans and Black Americans, and the language was very much used to create this fear, and it wasn't rooted in science, right? And seeing that history and how it continues to play out in the lives of the clients we serve in this city, and New York City is supposed to be this amazing liberal progressive city, and yet we still see insane levels of disproportionate impact of marijuana criminalization happening specifically to Black and Latinx communities, which is so deeply tied to that history, deeply tied to that initial use of community control that marijuana criminalization was built into our society, right? And so with that awareness, I knew once I heard about the Start Smart Coalition that was going to be my number one goal. I was going to get marijuana legalized in this state with every effort I could, with a team of brilliant activists, organizers, attorneys, and advocates throughout the state. And so with that in mind, I knew from my practice as a public defender what it looked like to see people harmed by marijuana criminalization. And the people who are mostly harmed in this city have been young people. Young Black and Latinx kids are stopped at disproportionate rates. I remember in 2019, the numbers that we collected just from our own data from representing people was roughly about 90% of all of our marijuana cases were Black and Latinx kids. And when you think about that, knowing that we live in New York City, especially now with marijuana being legal and we're seeing everyone being open with their usage, it was never just Black and Latinx young people who were engaging in marijuana usage, right? It's all sorts of people like moms in Park Slope and couples in the Upper East Side or Central Park. And it's marijuana usage is across racial backgrounds essentially standard. Like most people use it at the same rates regardless of race. And so knowing that, I understood the importance of diving into this issue. And I understood that even though we have so many other things that we still have to fight for, this win will have a substantial impact on young people's lives.
Thanks, Anne. Anthony, as the supervising attorney in our community justice unit, could you talk a little bit about what you saw in terms of the enforcement of marijuana laws, from the perspective of our community partners and the groups that are on the ground there?
Sure. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for being here for this important conversation. As Anne was mentioning, I also have a prior history of working as a public defender as well as Emma. So all three of us can speak to the experience of seeing the ways in which marijuana prohibition was used as a tool of mass criminalization to also control Black and Brown communities. And so I lived that firsthand when I was representing people in the county of Queens. And then when I transitioned into this work and in supporting our cure violence partners, I just saw the same patterns play out. So New York City went from periods where it had upwards of 50,000 marijuana arrests in one single year. And if you think about that and you just let that number sink in, that put New York City on the map where it was often referred to as the marijuana arrest capital of the world. And as Anne was mentioning, those arrests were not happening at an equal rate in every community or every neighborhood. They were concentrated primarily in Black and Latinx neighborhoods. So what had happened throughout the past 50 years in New York was that there was a setup of Jim Crow policing when it came to marijuana enforcement, right? So what that meant was that you were more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession depending on where you lived and the color of your skin. That was the main controlling thing. So we would see it here. I would see it here when I was coming into Manhattan, and people would be smoking. People would be smoking in Soho. They would be smoking in some of the parks, and they weren't getting arrested the way the clients and communities that we serve were in East New York, in South Jamaica, in Staten Island, in Harlem. And so that is the lens through which I understood why it was so important to mobilize our communities into marijuana legalization, to be a part of the movement, to be a part of seeking to get rid of that Jim Crow enforcement and work towards legalization that could make these communities whole and could stop the disastrous consequences that were attached to every single one of those arrests, right? When I say that we had periods of upwards of 50,000 arrests, that means every single life there had been traumatized, families had been separated, people had lost jobs, people had faced harsh immigration consequences, in some instances, even deportation. And so I kept seeing the same abusive patterns of policing in the communities. I remember speaking to community members who would call me through the services that the Community Justice Unit provides to say, we were just subjected to a raid in our home, and the police came and destroyed our property, and they arrested my son and his nephew because they found some marijuana laying on the counter table or somewhere else in the home. So that having found that marijuana, the police will say, well, this gives us a reason to arrest all of you. I would get calls about, well, I was just with my friends and the police officer said that they smelled marijuana, so they subjected us to a search. They found a unlit marijuana cigarette nearby and they claimed that it was ours, and so they arrested all three of us. I remember also, this was one of our clients that was represented by the Criminal Defense Practice Office in Staten Island, who was stopped in his car. The police claimed that they smelled marijuana when they approached the car, and they arrested our client for that. And when the body-worn camera video was later released to the attorneys, it actually showed that one of the officers was planting that bag of marijuana in our client's vehicle, right? So, and that's at a time when we already had access to that footage through the body-worn camera, because we didn't have that in prior years where we were living under the regime of people being stopped and frisked and these kinds of practices still existing. So how many more people were subjected to similar stops? How many more people were processed through the system through unlawful arrest on the basis that the police officers smelled marijuana or that they claimed that marijuana had recently been burning in that area? And so all of those reasons propelled me to be as part of the Start Smart Coalition, to work with allies, community groups, with the Drug Policy Alliance, and with others that were seeking to change the way New York City had set up this Jim Crow policing era of marijuana. And so that's what really brought me and inspired me to be a part of this effort.
Thanks, Anthony. Emma, I want to turn to you and turn a little bit to the kind of question of how did we do this? Like, you know, we legalized marijuana. How did we make that happen? And if you could talk a bit about what the coalition was like, what was Legal Aid's role in the coalition, and you know, what were those kind of overall top line critical ingredients to getting a coalition together that could push us into, you know, what you know, again, people are talking about as one of the, you know, the model for marijuana legalization across the country.
Absolutely. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. So it was a lot of hard work. I mean, that's the kind of big picture. The coalition was a really broad-based coalition of legal services organizations, grassroots organizations, and individuals that really came together. And what we've seen, at least what I've seen in Albany, is that that's what's necessary to really make substantial change in Albany, is to have a coalition like we had in the Start Smart Coalition. Being a public defender in the coalition, I found to be extremely valuable and really framed a lot of what the legislation does. So Anthony was talking about people being searched when they're in their car, but they're not smoking, people being stopped on the street, these kinds of things. And Anthony will go through it a little bit more, but a lot of those things can't happen anymore. And that's because of Anthony, Anne, and me, to a large degree, really inserting our experience as public defenders and coming at it from that perspective, and really speaking directly with people in Albany about what the language should look like, and telling those stories. So having us there as both lawyers, but also people that have done this work for years, I think really made a big difference. And I felt very proud as a public defender to be part of the coalition. I also, we have expungement in the MRTA. It wasn't there. And I started, this was 7 years in the making. And a few years into it, the bill wasn't, it was kind of moving, but it hadn't been passed yet. And they wrote a new version of the bill. And I said, why don't we have expungement in there? If we're addressing collateral consequences, then we need to expunge old convictions. And they added it in, and we have it now, which is just incredible. But I feel very proud, and I think public defenders play an important role in framing criminal justice issues and really bringing those stories forward and tying them into the legal language that we need to actually stop those things from happening. So it was a huge effort, and we definitely shouldn't get all the credit, but I definitely think Anne, Anthony, and I were able to help in some significant ways.
So, Anthony, one thing I've always wondered about is what role do you think that changes in public opinion and public attitudes toward marijuana played in this? You know, I mean, it does seem like, you know, those attitudes are evolving and changing, but also that public attitudes about the criminal legal system in general are evolving and changing. And what do you think about those threads and how they kind of came in and intersected with the coalition and timing and everything?
So New York's joined now, I believe, 18 states that have legalized recreational adult use marijuana. And before we were there, what we did have as a benefit was seeing what had played out in those states that had fully legalized marijuana, and that we could talk to community members about some of the common myths that they had or that the media was putting out in regards to what would happen once marijuana was legalized. So people would say, well, youth use is going to go up, crime is going to go up, but studies from those states that have legalized would show otherwise. And so we could always go back and say, look, we have the benefit of hindsight from these states that have legalized. That's not going to be the case here. That's not going to happen. We also had polls and surveys that would show that, I believe, like close to 60%, if not higher, of Americans agreed that marijuana should be legalized, and that number was not very different from polls taken here in New York. So that was a huge benefit to the movement, because it would show that a majority of people were in favor of having marijuana legalized. And so those two things, like knowing that other states have legalized, but also knowing that the majority of people would understand how unjust it was to continue living under a war on marijuana that was primarily impacting Black and Latinx and minority communities. And being able to continuously go back to these points and say, look, this is right, it's not being enforced across the board equally, and marijuana use across different races is almost the same, but it's not the way that people are actually experiencing it because of the way in which the criminal justice system is set up or the policing system is set up. And so those two trends really helped propel the movement even further, and to get across the finish line, almost, so to speak.
Thanks. You know, one of the things that I find really amazing about this story is, you know, a lot of people think, you know, you say, you know, 18 states and New York has this reputation of being really progressive. Like, why are we in the middle of the pack? And as opposed to like leading on this issue, or at least, you know, that was the situation last year. And, you know, one of the things I've always found really interesting about this is that we almost did this a couple of times and it didn't happen. And so I wonder, Anne, if you could tell us about that part of it. Like, why did this kind of keep coming close but not happening? Why did it take so long? Basically, you know, it kind of we seemed to be on the cusp of legalization for a long time. So what's that story about?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely go into that. I think one of the key things about the way that we legalized marijuana in New York was that we really took like a 360 approach to thinking about all the ways that marijuana criminalization, specifically prohibition, how it's impacted communities of color, how it's really siphoned out resources from Black and Latinx communities. And so with that in mind, the legislation that we drafted did look at other states. Like Anthony said, we looked to see what other states had done. We were able to see the great things that happened in other states, like how criminalization did, like the lack of criminalization shifted some ways in which people were harmed. But we also noticed things that were not considered or thought about while that legalization push happened earlier in previous decades, right? And so we took the lessons that we could see from those states and applied it to our work here. And we centered racial equity and racial justice in the work that we did with our legalization push in this state. So we talked about what does it look like for people who were criminalized to have access to this now legalized market? So what do we do with the legacy market to ensure that they're not pushed out? Because for many communities of color, especially when family members have already been criminalized, whether it's from marijuana or other low-level offenses that pushes them out of the traditional job market, they have been feeding their families off of marijuana in the legacy market. So if we're going to legalize this, how do we ensure that those people are able to still participate? How do we ensure that expungement is at the forefront so that people are not walking around with the criminalization scarlet letter that prohibits them from accessing housing, prohibits them from being able to stay with their families if they are immigrants, or increases their likelihood of not being able to get employment. We also looked at other processes around what does it look like to ensure that communities get direct resources from the tax revenue, right? A lot of states implemented legalization and that tax revenue went right into the state bucket for general use. But the communities that were the hardest hit, and when we talk about criminalization, it's really important for us to recognize when someone's criminalized, that's an economic drain. So when you have it in a mass way happening to the same communities and the same people over and over again, what's happening is there's a tax that's happening to that community that no one else is sharing the burden of. And it literally siphons out resources. So we're talking about families paying bail or paying for attorneys or paying court fees. All of those things, are having a loved one incarcerated. All of those things do take away economic resources. So how can we also make sure there's an economic justice component to legalization? And we built that in. And I will talk about that a little bit later, so I don't want to go too deep into that yet, but making sure that we thought about that early on. And so with that in mind, it made legalization for us a little bit more complex, right? Like we could have just gotten legalization that allowed for people to have access to marijuana for adult use, but not consider the economic consequences, not consider the criminalization consequences, and not consider the legacy market. And we refused. Quite often, what we would find, especially many of our legislators who maybe weren't as apt at thinking about this 360 approach, were more than willing at times to try to push through something that could just get it done. But our champions, our Senator Kruger, as well as Crystal Peoples-Stokes, held the line and they held it firm with us. And our Start Smart Coalition didn't fracture on this issue. We all understood the importance of legalization, but we understood the importance of making sure that was done right. And so in 2019, we came really, really close. But one of the things that we saw happening was that it was getting watered down and it was being shifted away from what our goal was, which is to ensure that families were no longer going to experience the type of discrimination and the type of harm that marijuana prohibition has had on them, specifically Black and Latinx families. And so we walked away from the table. We said we would have no legalization, then have a mixed or watered down or tepid legalization. Mm-hmm. And so we fought to maintain that same push. And I'm not gonna lie, when that happened in 2019, my heart was broken. I remember being in the Capitol with Anthony and like Cassandra and many people sitting there feeling defeated and feeling frustrated, but knowing that we are gonna continue to fight, no longer how long it takes. And thankfully we were successful and we have many fights that we're still gonna keep that same momentum on. But this was one of the few times where you can look back and be like, we did it. We walked away, but we didn't know, but we had faith and it came back and we got everything we wanted and more.
Yeah, I think anybody who's done a negotiation, whether legislative experience or other kind of negotiation can relate to that kind of, that tension. That's a really interesting part of this. So we talked about how, let's talk about what it is. And I wonder if we could kind of transition to like, what did we do? What does it actually say? What is it about the MRTA that makes it a model? Where is it still, meeting, where is it imperfect? And we see those imperfections and talk about them. So I think, Anthony, I think, if you could just get us started in that kind of 101, like take us through the statute. What is New York's new regime here?
So the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act is definitely a landmark legislation for New York and a model for the rest of the country for several reasons, right? The first one is that it addresses significantly collateral consequences. It allows for expungement, as Emma was mentioning. The community reinvestment pieces of the legislation are significant in that here, as we see, right, 40% of tax revenue from marijuana sales is to go to communities that were disproportionately impacted by the drug war. And that was a huge, huge fight, right? We can simply read that and go over it, but that was actually one of the reasons why the legislation did not pass in previous years, was because there was a big holdup about where the the money of legal marijuana sales should go. So 40% to impacted communities, 40% to schools and public education, and 20% to drug treatment, prevention, and education are huge, huge wins for the communities, and something that we hope to see people benefiting from in the next, as early as next year, really. The Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act right now, immediately as it was signed, allows for the adult use of cannabis, so people over the age of 21. It's expunging criminal records. It creates equity programs that will allow people to access loans, grants, and incubator programs so that they can have as much opportunities and resources to participate in this new industry, especially if they had been previously impacted by the criminalization of marijuana. The other reasons why it is significant, if we can maybe go to the next slide. Here, we just wanted to highlight some of the collateral consequences that now are also addressed through the legislation. So, in the areas of housing, education, employment, the administration of children's services, professional licensing, and all of these areas, which were areas that we were seeing communities and families being torn apart as a result of low-level marijuana possession, are addressed through the legislation. So, these are huge, huge wins, because if these pieces had not been included in the legislation, it would have been, like Anne said, a watered down version, a version that we were not willing to accept, because people's lives would continue to be impacted by the criminalization of marijuana. So right now, for example, in the ACS context, knowing that the use of marijuana, right, lawful use, cannot be used to separate families. That's huge, right? Because we were seeing how it was being used to separate families. Knowing in the education context that it's not going to be harming people or making them lose opportunities for education. In housing, knowing that people, right, the lawful use of marijuana, unless the landlord would lose a federal benefit, or there's a general non-smoking policy, can be used to target people. These are all areas that are significant, and what makes the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act such a large landmark legislation for New York and for the country as well. I think if we can go on to the next slide, just to talk a little bit more about the criminal, the previous one. Yep. So just to cover a little bit about the changes to the criminal penalty, something that Emma was mentioning earlier has to do with the way the odor of marijuana can no longer be used to serve as an analysis for probable cause. So in the past, the experiences that I was sharing where clients and community members were subjected to stops, were subjected to searches, as a result of the police officer claiming, well, I smell marijuana, therefore I'm going to search your entire vehicle, or I'm going to compel you to show me what's in your pockets or show me what's in your bag and force you to this unlawful search. That's no longer the case. And as Emma was mentioning, it's a big, big, big win. And it's also in part something that shows that having public defenders on the coalition really made a significant difference in the ultimate legislation that we had, because had this not been changed in the law, we could still be facing a situation where marijuana is legal, but police are still able to use it as a justification to conduct these unlawful stops and to bring us back to that Jim Crow policing era. And so just to highlight a few things from the slide, anyone 21 years of age or older can possess up to 3 ounces of cannabis inside or outside of the home. Pretty soon, that's going to go up to them being able to possess up to 5 pounds in the home, and higher amounts if prescribed by a doctor. There have also been huge entire changes under the penal law of a section that was called Section 221. So all of the legalization of marijuana is now found in the penal law under Chapter 222. And smoking cannabis right now in New York City and New York is allowed in any place where otherwise you could also smoke a cigarette, right? So in areas where smoking cigarettes is banned, you're not allowed to smoke cigarettes. To smoke cannabis, and you are allowed to give lawful amounts of marijuana to other people 21 and over, as long as there's no compensation exchange. And so because the dispensaries and the sales have not started yet, this is what can currently happen. So it's called like the compensation or exchange, as long as, right, you're not passing money in exchange for it. So these are some of the main areas of the law. I don't know if Anne and Emma have others that they want to go into that I might have missed, but these are some of the main areas that make this kind of legislation so important to the communities and clients that we serve.
Yeah, maybe I think it'd be worth, you know, Emma and Anne, if you could take us into kind of your areas of expertise. Emma, maybe you could start and tell us more about expungement and how important it was and how it works, just kind of a top line. And then when you've done that, Anne, if you could talk a bit more about you know, you were talking about the community reinvestment part of it, and you know, there are really two sides to that. One is what happens to the money, right? Which Anthony gave us the formula, and maybe you could give some context to how that's going to work. But then also the other side of it, which is about the provisions in the law about opportunities to enter the new legal marketplace. So maybe we could go over those two things, but Emma, I'll turn it over to you. Maybe you can start with expungement.
Okay, thank you. So expungement means kind of clearing the record so that it doesn't appear anywhere anymore. And just for people that aren't familiar with expungement and why it's valuable, there are thousands, literally thousands of barriers to people participating in society when they have a criminal record. And that's even for something like a misdemeanor marijuana possession conviction. That can prevent people from getting federal loans. It can prevent people from getting housing, going to college, getting jobs, getting licensing, getting life insurance. The list of consequences of a criminal conviction is endless. So when we're talking about these issues and the over-policing, there are hundreds of thousands of people with marijuana convictions from the past, before marijuana was legalized, that are still burdened by those convictions. So expungement aims to remove those barriers for people. What's really great about the MRTA's expungement is that it's automatic. So there is nothing that people have to do. There is no application they need to file. It just happens automatically if they have a conviction for one of the offenses that's eligible. Just very quickly, that's essentially any old conviction for possession of up to a pound or sale of up to 3 ounces, because those things are no longer crimes under the current law. So the expungement, the automatic expungement provisions are amazing. Between a 2019 law that had automatic expungement but didn't have anything else we really wanted in the MRTA, and then the MRTA's passage this year, there have been about 350,000 cases in New York State that have been automatically expunged. And that's, you know, 350,000 barriers times however many thousands of barriers that have been removed for people. It is still, even with the automatic expungement, I can tell you from being a person that practices this, there are still tons of questions and it's still complicated. So people don't have to do anything, but whether your record has been expunged, what it means to have your record expunged, how do you answer a job application? All of those kinds of things still require lawyers and still require assistance. But the actual expungement process being automatic is, it's the first automatic expungement. It's the first expungement actually in New York State. It didn't exist in the law until 2 years ago. And there was no automatic expungement provision. So it's made a huge difference, and is hopefully the beginning of a lot more automatic expungement laws moving forward that I'll talk about later.
So I guess that's my cue. So going back into the equity provisions, and what we were really fighting for was to ensure that, like I mentioned earlier, that the legacy market would be able to integrate into the new legalized market. And so one of the main components of the MRTA was to ensure that there were social equity licenses. So 50% of all marijuana seller licenses and marijuana producer licenses will have to come from social equity applicants. And what counts as a social equity applicant is people from communities that were the hardest hit on the war on drugs. So if you live in the zip codes where it is obvious that there were high levels of criminalization and high levels of marijuana arrest, you can qualify for a social equity license. Women-owned businesses can qualify, and also minority-owned businesses. And I hate that term minority, but what it really is getting at is essentially Black and Latinx and other marginalized racial identity groups are able to get a business license or a social equity license to be able to produce. The fascinating thing with the way that we constructed our legalization scheme in New York State is that we actually have a vertical integration model. And what that means, because like people throw that term around and it's kind of like, what are you getting at? It really means that all the different levels of producing marijuana, so we're talking about like from the farm to the people who actually like do the transit and moving it from like, say, like upstate to like the local sellers on the ground, to the people who own the shops who sell, and also the people who might own the shops where people can have consumption sites. It is broken into or broken up so that there's not going to be a monopoly, right? So only if you have a micro business or if you're one of the limited medical marijuana providers can you have a fully one like siloed market. So you might have your own independent farms if you're a micro business, and you can have your own independent mechanisms for like moving it down and getting it to the state, and your own independent shop. But that's micro businesses. The reason why we created something like that is because what we saw in other states is that once legalization took place, huge monopolies started immediately, right? So you look at like what's happening in California, what's happening in Oregon, many of those states are going backwards and trying to rework their system to allow for smaller businesses to enter the market. And what we're trying to do in New York, and we'll see how that actually plays out, is trying to avoid that type of predatory businesses coming into a market where, like I said earlier, many people who were in the legacy market were feeding their families with this industry. And so how do we ensure that they can still have access when there's so much money already in big marijuana coming into the state? And so the vertical integration model kind of breaks it up so that any large supplier who's maybe already working in a different state doesn't really have the ability to come in and just bulldoze their way into having the biggest lion's share of the stake in our market here. On top of that, so that's going into the piece around how do we form our businesses. And this has already been mentioned, but the Office of Cannabis Management will also be monitoring how that's going, right? So we're creating a whole new bureaucratic infrastructure to ensure that we have the mechanisms and tools to see how implementation can be created in a way that actually maintains the spirit of the legislation that we passed. And so with the OCM, which is the Office of Cannabis Management, they will also be in charge of not just making sure licenses are done in a way that's equitable, but they will also be in charge of making sure that the tax revenues are equally split in a way that ensures that communities that were the hardest hit has access to that money. And so with that comes in the community reinvestment funds. And so those funds will have money set aside for grant opportunities for the communities that were the hardest hit with the war on drugs. And that looks like incubator programs for small businesses that want to get into the marijuana trade, being able to get small business loans so that they can be able to enter in without having to have that upfront cash, right? So if you're coming from a community that was the hardest hit, as I've mentioned already, you're less likely to have access to banks that will loan you money. And because this industry is not federally legal yet, it's also, you can't go to FDIC insured bank to be able to get a loan to say, I'm going to start this technically illegal in the federal system business. And so creating the incubator program allows for smaller businesses and smaller families and smaller community members to be able to enter the market without having that upfront deep pockets that bigger marijuana companies already have access to. It also has a public education piece, right? So there's going to be money put into making sure that our general population is educated on marijuana. There's access to research so that we can actually really learn about all of the ways that marijuana can be used healthfully, as well as the consequences of marijuana usage. Because it's been scheduled, a scheduled drug for so long, we actually haven't done as much scientific research on the ways in which marijuana can be a health benefit to many people. We know about it a little bit. That's one of the reasons why the discourse around marijuana has shifted. But now New York State's going to have the opportunity to really delve into that, right? Another aspect of it will be going to drug treatment programs. So we're talking about making sure that community members who, and not necessarily because they have substance use disorder around marijuana, but for community members who are using substances that they do not like the way that they interact with those substances, they will have access to clinical treatment to be able to help them balance the ways that they interact with different substances. And so it's really exciting to see something like this come along. We're literally creating a whole new way to interact with something that has been in the shadows for so long.
It's amazing. So, we're, I know we have a lot to share about, that overall picture is such a picture of incredible opportunities, but also incredible risks that our clients won't have their fair opportunity to participate in those benefits and to ensure that the protections that you fought so hard are available to them. I know we have a lot of information to share about that, but I want to make sure we have time for some Q&A. So I wonder, Aisha, why don't we start the Q&A now? And we'll try to work in a little bit more about what Legal Aid is doing to ensure that our clients, have all the information they need and the power and support that they need under this new regime into some of the answers to the questions if we can. Does that make sense? So I think
Yes.
we have a Q&A. Okay.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. So one question that has come in is, how can we ensure that the police will follow the law?
I'll take that question.
Go on, Ann.
We laughed mostly because as public defenders, we often know and recognize the fact that the police won't always follow the law, and there's actually not much we can actually do to prevent that, right? I think one of the main ways that you can try to help people protect their rights and access to marijuana is making sure community members are clearly aware of what their rights are, right? Understanding the law is the first step to be able to give people the ability to navigate tough, intense, and oftentimes dangerous situations with the police. And that's why, especially Anthony's work with the Community Justice Unit and doing Know Your Rights workshops, and even my work with activists and community members, really gives people the tools so that they know how to navigate what happens if the police are interacting with them and violating their rights. I think the other aspects of thinking about it just from the individual community member side is empowering community. I think the other side of that is us as attorneys. That's why we're here. We will sue them. We will go after them. We will push for policies to be able to ensure that we can curtail their powers. And I think it's important to name that all of you here have the power to ensure that community members who are more vulnerable can be protected. You can demand for change on the legislative level. You can demand that your city representatives, your mayor, your city council members are highly aware of the fact that the ways that the police are interacting with vulnerable community members is something that you refuse to stand for. And making sure that you're vocal about those things can really change the public discourse and also ensure that when we are trying to push for that, there's community support, there's public support to support our assertions that the police should not be stopping people for marijuana. The police should not be searching young people for marijuana, even if they're underage using it. That's not the goal of this. The goal is to give those young people access to public education and to make sure that they know that they are aware of what the consequences or benefits of marijuana usage might be, depending if they have medical issues. And so just being really vocal about not wanting to live in the type of city where we honestly can't guarantee that the people who are supposed to serve us is going to do so in a way that's equitable and right to young people, especially Black and Latinx young people.
We have another question that's come in. What happens if someone under the age of 21 is caught using marijuana?
So under the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, that person under the age of 21 is subject to a civil penalty of not more than $50. That penalty is prohibited from carrying any collateral consequences or resulting in any forfeiture of rights or privileges. And again, right, vast difference from before in that that would be the reason for an arrest, potential contact with the criminal justice system in the form of a desk appearance ticket. And it's a huge change from what before people on the opposite side of, I guess, in the opposition would say that we needed, which was like, oh, let's decriminalize. But decriminalization would still mean people being subjected to arrest and being put through the system. And so that's what would happen to somebody under the age of 21 caught using marijuana right now.
Great, thank you. Another question's come in. What is the biggest obstacle to passing this federally? To passing this similar law on a federal level?
I mean, I'll jump in on that. I think the answer, I mean, I think there are several substantial obstacles. You know, most significantly, we don't have an administration that is currently enamored of the idea of legalizing marijuana. And in the absence of a champion, I mean, look, in the absence of a champion, I don't think a legislative proposal has any hope. I mean, we can look at criminal legal reform issues that do have, you know, champions in the current administration and see how difficult those are, whether you're looking at the Justice and Policing Act, for example. But this administration isn't interested in that. And we've seen that also in the way that the administration has, I think, to the surprise of some people, not taken a particularly progressive approach to the interaction between the federal government and states that have legalized marijuana. Although that's kind of an ongoing and I think evolving issue for the Biden administration. So I think for now, it seems like the movement is really focused on a state-by-state strategy still, because that seems to be where the success is happening. And I think Anthony and Ann both spoke a lot about how the successful history of decriminalization and legalization, you know, it builds momentum. It built it for New York as well. And I think maybe as that continues to progress, we might see changes, but it's hard to see that happening in the immediate future.
Great. And can you talk a little bit more about how this legislation fits into the legal aid's overall priorities and criminal defense, criminal justice reform priorities over the coming year?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take that one. I mean, our legal aid really focuses on criminal legal issues that we do look at two things. We fundamentally look at what is going to have the greatest impact on our client community. You know, we represent low-income New Yorkers. The populations that are disproportionately caught up in the criminal legal system tend to be Black and Latinx and you know, BIPOC people, New Yorkers, and so we focus on the things that are affecting those communities most directly. And our goal is to keep people out of the criminal legal system, to reduce the degree to which interaction with the criminal legal system has become, you know, just too common a characteristic of life for certain kinds of New Yorkers. And so the MRT, I mean, Ann and Anthony and Emma all spoke about from their perspective as public defenders, why the MRTA obviously fit into that category. And our continuing priorities are, you know, are all in that vein. So this year we spent an enormous amount of time working on shrinking the parole system and trying to reduce the ways in which violations of rules of parole, including technical rules of parole. So you're out, you've served a sentence and you're out and you miss a meeting, or you aren't where you're supposed to be, or you don't report a change in job or a change in address to your parole officer. Those kind of, or you test positive for marijuana, which is now legal. Those are all can be parole rule violations that result in cycles of reincarceration that make it impossible for people to rehabilitate fully and reintegrate into their community and escape the kind of clutches of the criminal legal system. So we focused on that and got some legislation passed this year, the Less is More Act, that will hopefully, if the governor signs it, it's waiting Governor Cuomo's signature, will have a great effect on that. And we continue to focus on those priorities. And maybe this would be a great time, I think, to talk a little bit about Clean Slate. which is a bill that is very high on our priority list too, that we almost passed. I mean, we're hopeful. Emma, I want Emma to talk about this bill, but I just want to say that when you listen to Emma talk about this bill, we're very hopeful that in a year from now, we'll be telling that story that Anne told about 2019 and the MRTA about Clean Slate, because we had we almost got there this year and it didn't happen, but we're not done yet. So Emma, why don't you talk a little about Clean Slate and how that relates to these issues?
Thanks, Corey. So Clean Slate is an automatic sealing and expungement bill that really almost passed. I mean, minutes away from passing in Albany on the last day of session this year. There is still a chance. There was actually just a press conference starting at 12:30 today to call on legislators to come back to Albany for a special session to pass Clean Slate over the summer. That is a possibility, so we'll see. Really, one of the things that we found, I work in record sealing. I do application-based sealing. There's a very limited sealing law right now that was passed in 2017 that we thought was going to be groundbreaking and was really going to change people's lives for the better. There are about 600,000 people that are eligible under that law. 2,500 people, 2,500 people total statewide have had their records sealed through this application-based system. So it's just not working. And it's been very frustrating as an attorney doing this work to do everything I can to raise awareness, to represent people. I've represented people in my project. I've done more sealing applications than anyone in the state, but it's still 200 versus the hundreds of thousands of people whose records have been expunged through legislative changes in New York in the last few years that I've been involved in. So automatic sealing and expungement are definitely the way to go and are the way to really equalize the playing field and address the inherent racial justice issues that are at play when we're talking about criminal record discrimination. Clean Slate is very exciting because we have found that around the state, around the country, when people get their records sealed or expunged, the financial benefit to those people and their families, but also to their communities, is really astounding. So in one state, they did a study where they had record sealing. They found that people on average a year after their records are sealed are making 25% more than they were when they had a public criminal record. They also found that people on average in their lives, if they have a criminal record, make $484,000 less in their lifetime, $484,000 less than people that don't have a criminal record. So when we talk about at Legal Aid really trying to address systemic cycles of poverty, that's what this is about. This is about giving people opportunities and allowing them to move forward with their lives. One of the things that I really think is the most incredible and makes sense to me, but I think to people that don't do this work is sometimes surprising, is that they did a study in Michigan where they have sealing and expungement, and they looked at recidivism rates. And they found that people that have had their record sealed are less likely to commit a new crime or less likely to recidivate than people that have never been arrested in their lives. So people that have had their records sealed, they had a conviction, they got their case sealed, and now they're able to move forward with their lives. They are actually better citizens, better community members than people that have never been in the system. And that, to me and to all of us, I think makes sense because we know what it's like to be in the system. We know how horrible it is and how much people don't want to go back there. So the MRTA has done a lot to address kind of some of the collateral consequences, but Clean Slate is a broader bill that is actually record clearance for almost all convictions after a certain period of time. So you have to stay out of trouble for a certain period of time, but your record would actually be sealed or expunged if you'd stayed out of trouble, and you would be able to move forward and get jobs and get housing and really move on with your life without that stigma hanging over you. So it's a pretty exciting law. It would have been, people in Albany were saying it would have been the most groundbreaking criminal justice law to ever pass in Albany. Didn't pass, but You know, I was also in Albany in 2019 when the MRTA didn't pass, and it was really, really devastating because there was no good reason why it didn't. Yeah, it's just politically it didn't happen. But we came back, and 2 years later it passed. So I have hope that the same thing will happen with Clean Slate, and that we'll be celebrating very soon.
I see we're almost out of time. There is one last question. I don't know if we can answer it very quickly from Andrew. Are there plans for broader drug legalization efforts? And if so, how would the implementation advocacy efforts differ from the marijuana law, if at all? I don't know if there's a quick 30-second answer to that one.
Yes.
I can try to take it. So yes, there are. But you know, I think with marijuana, this has been like a multiple decades fight and changing the way people even think about the consequences of using marijuana and shifting that discourse is really important to do something similar when it comes to other drugs. I think a lot of times when we talk about drug usage, we see it as like a moral failing, and our society needs to really shift away from that type of discourse. For people who are using drugs, especially for people who are having an irregular or a distorted relationship to drug usage, we really need it for their safety and for their protection to move away from this criminalization mentality and move away from thinking about it as them being either weak or having some type of problem. It's much more of looking at it as a healthcare issue, as well as an access to basic standards of living. Like people are more likely to use drugs in a way that is challenging for their daily lives when their daily lives are already challenging. And so how do we actually give people and community members the support they need so that they're not turning towards escapism, but if they are using drugs, they can do it in a healthy recreational relationship. And so that is a conversation that is starting to happen in the state, but we aren't at that point yet.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to help us conclude right now since we're out of time. I really appreciate all of you for joining us today, and a special thank you to Corey, Ann, Anthony, and Emma for joining us and sharing your expertise with all of us. I would also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to all of our 2,000 plus legal aid staff whose dedication ensures that every New Yorker has access to justice every day. Lastly, thank you to all of our supporters. We couldn't do this without you. If you're not a supporter yet and you'd like to be, we will share the link in the chat to donate. And we appreciate your interest, and thank you for being part of this important movement. And thank you for helping us deliver justice. And again, thank you and have a wonderful day. We'll send the recording soon. Bye-bye.